Hello and welcome. My name is Zafar Iqbal, and you are watching the Mojo story. India and Russia have firmed up a 5 year roadmap to expand trade and strategic ties. Now, all this despite US sanctions pressure. You can see on that screen Prime Minister Modi really going to the airport to receive President Putin last night. Now, Prime Minister Modi and President Putin have reaffirmed the strength of their partnership, with Modi urging an end to the Ukraine war through dialogue and diplomacy. Both sides have sealed the 2030 Economic Cooperation Plan and agreements on health, mobility, and people to people exchange, aiming to boost trade, ease regulations, and strengthen supply chains. Now, this is a very significant visit, not just for the optics of it, but also for its messaging. Today, to discuss on this, we're joined by an eminent panel. Let's introduce our guests. We're joined by Padma Rao. She's a senior journalist and has been covering foreign affairs for a long time. We're also joined by Madhavan Narayanan, senior journalist. Madhavanji, if I may start with you. Clearly, not just optics, there was a lot of inherent messaging when Prime Minister Modi went to the airport to receive Putin. Now, what is India signaling? Is India signaling a strategic rebalancing by deepening ties with Russia despite US sanctions pressure? We cannot ignore that India has been slapped by 25% additional tariff just by because it's buying oil from Russia. That's what the US has been saying repeatedly.
Well, the answer to that question very simply is a yes. But interesting, Zafar, that you use the word in spite of the US. No, no, it's not in spite of the US sanctions. It's because of the US sanctions that such a messaging has been required by India.
Right,
Now,
right.
I mean, rather than say Russia, I like to say Moscow because it brings back memories of the old Cold War alliance between India and the former Soviet Union. And you remember that Putin used to be a KGB agent himself in the
Right.
Soviet days. So there is a continuity there after a long hiatus or break because in 1991, both India and Soviet Union went through a turmoil. India through the balance of payments crisis, and Soviet Union literally broke up. Therefore, you had to pick up the pieces from there. After that, India went more towards the US. But recent events seem to suggest that at one level, a lot has changed, which is India US having huge trade. We'll probably discuss that at length a little later if you look at the details. But because of recent developments, particularly the penal tariffs, the arm twisting linked to
Yeah.
India buying Russian oil, which basically means that the West in general, especially Europe, because under Trump, US is less in that sense, but wants India to be a Western ally, but without any meaningful terms. You know, you can't punish some country and want it to be an ally. So there is
Right.
a certain post-colonial hangover still there, as I see it. But that's why the optics of this visit are very, very important. You know, you can discuss it in three parts, as it were: optics, geopolitics, and economy, or
Yeah.
bilateral trade.
Yeah.
They are all linked, joined at the hip, as it were. But I think the optics are very, very clear. Two things. One is, I was watching an interview with President Putin yesterday to an Indian channel, and he's measured in his words, and so is Modi in some ways. But
Yeah.
more than the words, the body language and the optics, such as taking a common car ride together,
Yes.
gifting a copy of the Gita, and then having, Russia today, the channel is having a big relaunch towards the Indian market. And, Modi just spoke about Indians learning Russian as part of a very important step in the trade ties, which we can go at length later. But all this shows that there is a bounce back to some of the elements of the Cold War days when India had signed even a peace and friendship treaty with the Soviet Union. Some of it is completely circumstantial, pressured by Western Europe and also US, which basically means this is a new India. It's always technically, even during the Cold War days, India was a non aligned movement leader. Now it calls itself the global South leader. If you look at it hard, there is not too much of a difference. India wants to maintain what we call strategic autonomy. But uh, the messaging from this visit very clearly is that this autonomy is not just a slogan. They're
Yeah,
willing to go that extra mile. And the details emerged. In fact, got a bit late for your show because Modi just finished what was a very, very interesting speech. Therefore, it had a sense of detail which was missing yesterday
right,
in the early views, or even the joint statement issued by Modi and Putin just about 90 minutes ago
right.
did not have the kind, or 2 hours ago, did not have the detail that Modi had in his speech to the Indo-Russian Business Forum, which has just again been launched. So
Hmm.
that's where the interesting needle lies. There are other issues related to defense and the details. We can talk about it later, I suppose. Yeah.
Right. Padmarao, the fact is that India had drifted a bit towards the US in the last few years, but it's sort of become a wake up call for India, the way that Trump has been repeatedly targeting India and India has been slapped by 50% tariffs. Now, that has only helped India to move back uh, to strengthening ties with Russia, something that must have proved counterproductive for the US. This is not going to work here. Instead of work the other way around for the US, India has absorbed those tariffs for the moment. The negotiations are still underway for that trade deal, but India has not buckled under that pressure, and that's what one would assume, one would clearly say that the outcome of this meeting has a lot to do with what's happened over the last few months, particularly the way that Trump has dealt with India.
Yeah. Hi. I wouldn't call it drifted away in recent years. I would say that the India-US relationship, at least since 2000, I think the beginning of the 2000s, has since liberalization began and reforms began. I mean, don't let's not forget the civil nuclear deal. It goes back. That's when it actually
Yeah,
began, the burgeoning of the relationship with the United States. And I certainly
Yeah.
don't see a kind of a, if one grows, so this is a kind of a backlash to what happened to backlash to the tariffs being imposed, or backlash to various measures like the H1B taken by President Trump. What I see it as is, as Madhavan was saying, a sign. Okay, this is, I think, the key, the major part of this visit lies in the optics, and it's got resounding optics around the world, as we're seeing, including, with an interview thrown in with a prominent Indian channel and all that. Now, what I'd like to point out are a few different issues. There is much talk that the visiting president wants defense deals to be wrapped, oil supply to continue, and there's a lot of talk. Even in that interview, he spoke a lot about labor, Indian labor. I think this is a very obvious attempt to address what is feared India may have lost in the H1B fracas in the United States. I'll come to whether that is a viable option or an alternative or not in a minute. But what I'd like to say is that I think it is unlikely that things will suddenly swing dramatically overnight. From the United States back to the old ally Russia, the largest part of the Soviet Union, so to speak. This is, I think, to my mind, primarily a show of strength, both as old allies, both as partners in various fora like BRICS, and the potential held by BRICS to challenge the US dollar that has come increasingly into the news now, crept into the headlines. And one more interesting thing for me, I think India is seeing itself. Now, this is very interesting, seeing itself initially covertly, as a staging ground, and eventually as the stage, perhaps, as a peacemaker. If you look at this interesting trajectory of the Europe-Russia face-off, there were all these editorials that appeared in newspapers written by Western ambassadors, and then there was, please don't tell me that there was no prior awareness that these editorials are being written. More so, given the recent talk of how the press advisor in the PMO is reportedly on WhatsApp to the Indian media and reportedly determines headlines every day. I find it absolutely impossible and unlikely that the Indian government did not know that these editorials were coming by the European ambassadors, And I also think
but
that,
what does that
no,
mean,
one second, let me
Padma?
finish. Yeah, so
Yeah,
they knew, if you let me finish, I could explain
yeah,
to you.
yeah,
Obviously, they're going to criticize Putin, and they're going to lay out, various peace plans or whatever. Now, and I think it was intentional, the letting them, I mean, there was barely a kind of a mild rebuke from the Indian government on the heels of these editorials. And then subsequently, there were all these responses from the Russian side to the ambassador and various other officials who placed their editorials and their counter opinions in the media. I think this is an indirect way of talking. I think this is an indirect way, and I think India is quite happy to play that staging ground. And it's actually quite a smart move because, eventually it could perhaps give way to a stage for a three-way handshake with Mr. Modi standing in the middle as global peacemaker. This is a role, as you know, which is much sought after worldwide. And I think India, one of the things that India is looking at through his visit and through this, everything that preceded the visit and everything that will follow it in terms of commentary, in terms of criticism, I think India is well poised to play that mediatory role, provided there is no further pressure from the United States or any kind of adverse reactions from the United States to the country. But I still believe that the United States is very, very key to India. It's not a question of give the one up for the other. So this is for me the main thrust of this visit. One, India is possibly positioning itself as a peacemaker between the West and Russia, and Mr. Putin himself has said several times that he has discussed his ideas of a peace plan with the Indian administration and with Prime Minister Modi. He
Right.
repeated that again at the press conference today. So that is the thrust for me. The optics, as Madhavan said, certainly, and that I do not see it as a sign of veering away from the United States and swinging wildly back into the arms of the Russians. I don't see that. And the third thing is setting up a stage in a very, very sophisticated and subtle fashion to possibly be the mediator between the two sides.
Madhvanji, would
Zafar.
you agree that India can become a peacemaker, a mediator between the two sides? India has always said, even the Prime Minister said today, we'll use that soundbite in a bit, that India is on the side of peace. India has taken a
Yeah.
stand. That stand is India is on the side of peace. But that does not mean that India has opened up its cards and said that it's going to mediate between the two countries. Does India have that clout in the first place? And also, if Ukraine might want might want India to take a active role in that
Yeah.
direction, will that be the same? Will it be the case with Putin and Russia as well?
No, I don't think India effectively means in that sense. It raises India's stature as some country whose views matter, who can potentially, let's say, at least technically, theoretically, even host the way Turkey did some of the talks. So that kind of stuff is possible. But mediation, if you look at the details of what has been going on in Ukraine, it's a one-way street through and through. Even President Trump has thrown up his hands. Europe is anyway an interested party. Therefore, it's essentially between Putin and Zelensky, or Russia and Ukraine, as it were. But you cannot deny the fact that India is now not only a G20 member, has been the has held the presidency. I was myself, when I'm wearing this jacket from the G20 summit in St. Petersburg, Vladimir Putin's hometown where he was born, raised. So India has been quietly raising its profile, and we may joke about the Vishwaguru tag applied on Narendra Modi, but the fact is that even during Rajiv Gandhi's times, there was a major conference on disarmament when he led it. So India has always been trying to be a civilizational force. But to me, that seems less relevant or more like a matter of optics. I have my eyes on trade because today the big story, which many channels will miss, is the details of the Indo-Russian trade forum. There are two ways of looking at it. Let me elaborate. Padma very rightly brought out the civil nuclear agreement between India and US, which was signed during President George W. Bush's visit to India in 2006. So that changed everything from Pokhran test to the civil nuclear test and the software business. India's, today the next wave of artificial intelligence is not only going to be led by people like Sundar Pichai and Satya Nadella of Google and Microsoft. Perplexity, which is the big challenger to Google with its own browser, is led by Arvind Srinivas. Many people don't know this because people who watch only diplomacy and geopolitics keep repeating a couple of cliches. For me, Arvind Srinivas is part of the story. So there is a big relationship between India and US, even Trump can't do anything about it. Let me be very blunt. This is a relationship between two huge economies with cutting edge technology at play. You know, for India, India is a huge market for Meta, which is owns Facebook, and Alphabet that owns Google. So if you look at the numbers, let me show. We are in a very interesting stage of history, if I may say so, and I'd like viewers of Mojo to get that hang, because
Hmm.
one is quantitative, the other is qualitative, and we really have to take that into perspective to get a real picture. Indo-Russian trade is around $69 billion, but
Yes.
$64 billion of that is imports from Russia, mainly due to the post-Ukraine war oil imports. India's
Right.
exports are only $5 billion, which is very little. And whereas India's bilateral trade with the US is $132 billion,
Right.
in which India has a huge surplus,
Right.
whereas there's a huge deficit in favor of Russia. So India has much more to defend in its trade with the US,
Right.
and which is why the optics of Putin India summit, Modi summit means a lot, which means that India wants to speak from a position of strength against the penal tariffs as well as other things like the visa restrictions. Uh, my own, if you want me to stick my neck out, I would say that the MAGA lobby, they just saw the resignation of a right-wing congresswoman, Marjorie, I forget her name, but Trump's right wing itself is shaky because the long-term implications of U.S. business ties with India are much more than the power he wields at the White House. This is my assessment. But
Right.
so India has cannot let go of the US. It's not simply an either or situation that हम आपको छोड़ के रूस के साथ भाग जाएंगे, ऐसा कुछ नहीं है.
Yeah,
So,
that's
but what I found most interesting, which is for me the breaking news of today, is the details of the Russia-India Business Forum emerging are so interesting that this $100 billion figure that Modi speaks about is nothing. He himself said it's not a big deal because we are already at 69 billion. To reach 100 billion in 5 years with an economy that is growing at 7% per annum uh, is not a big deal. It's only 6-7% per year. But the qualitative details are very significant because there is a likelihood of India joining the Eurasian Free Trade Agreement, which means Russia, Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan. So they are all becoming part of India's potential market, where Indian resources and entrepreneurial abilities are much more likely to find their hold. And Modi even spoke about India and Russia together as a joint party addressing the African market. If you look at the complementarities between Indian and Russian resources, India has doctors, engineers, business houses that are capable of project execution. Lakshmi Mittal already has his steel plants in Kazakhstan.
right.
If you're looking at minerals in Kyrgyzstan, I see Vedanta and Anil Agarwal stepping there. If you look at construction, let's say Armenia or an airport, then Adani can go there. Modi spoke about cold chain logistics, in which there's a company called Snowman Logistics that very few realize has an Adani angle. So there's a
Right.
lot of potential in which some of that Indian push can be seen in the coming days, because I deliberately gave out hypothetical situations for people to get an idea of what it can go. Because if you look at Modi, when he took power in 2014, the foreign policy changed from a US orientation towards look east, and people
Right.
are reading into the fact that today the car that Putin and Modi took was a Fortuner, which is made by Toyota. So Japan is
Right.
the third angle of this triangle.
Yes.
So there is a lot of
Yeah.
multilateral
It's
potential and
very
optics. Yeah,
it's very
I'm just
very
sketching out a
interesting.
scenario. Yeah,
Yes.
so
Yes. It's
I think, but there's a lot to do. It's a long haul. I've just written an article
yes.
today saying that if you look at the numbers, then India cannot let go of the US. If you look at the
Yes.
potential, then Russia is, from look east, we can potentially go towards look northwest, as it were.
Right. Right.
So all that is making
Absolutely.
it a very interesting historic visit.
Absolutely, it's indeed a historic visit, very important, very significant. All eyes will be on this visit. Let's hear what Prime Minister Modi said in that joint statement.
लड़ाई में भारत और रूस ने लंबे समय से कंधे से कंधा मिलाकर सहयोग किया है। पहलगाम में हुआ आतंकी हमला हो या क्रोकस सिटी हॉल पर किया गया कायरतापूर्ण आघात, इन सभी घटनाओं की जड़ एक ही है। भारत का अटल विश्वास है कि आतंकवाद मानवता के मूल्यों पर सीधा प्रहार है और इसके विरुद्ध वैश्विक एकता ही हमारी सबसे बड़ी ताकत है। भारत और रूस के बीच यूएन, G20, ब्रिक्स, एससीओ तथा अन्य मंचों पर करीबी सहयोग रहा है। करीबी तालमेल के साथ आगे बढ़ते हुए हम इन सभी मंचों पर अपना संवाद और सहयोग जारी रखेंगे। एक्सेलेंसी,
Padmaji is very significant. He mentioned Pahalgam and he said that the root cause of the terror is the same, whether it's happening in Russia or in India. Now, that is something very important because we know that there was an exchange with Pakistan in during Operation Sindoor, that the cause for that was Pahalgam terror attack, and the way the things have been developing ever since.
Yeah. Zafar, I'm glad you bring up terrorism, and I'm glad the Prime Minister brought it up, of course, because, see, Mr. Modi said that, India and Russia have been long standing shoulder to shoulder in this fight. And he mentioned the terrorist attack on the Crocus City Hall in Moscow,
Yeah.
and the one in Pahalgam, etc., etc. But, I think much will depend on how Modi, because it all boils down to one man's freedom fighter, another man's terrorist.
Yeah.
And in this case, Russia has calibrated its relationship. There is a newfound relationship with Pakistan and with China, And so in the case of terrorism, I think India means one thing, and Russia may perhaps know what India means, but may not, really much will depend on how Russia calibrates and whether Russia calibrates its own relationship to Pakistan primarily, and to an extent also China, as far as the border issues with China are concerned, to protect India's interests. Now, that will again be a give and take. There are no free lunches. There will always be a give and take, required and demanded of India if we really want Russia to take a stronger stance. Now, let's not also forget Afghanistan, which you and I, Zafar, have spoken of very often on this forum. There is much happening in Afghanistan. All the big players have reconverged in Afghanistan. That includes Russia and India. And that includes Russia as the newfound a friend, if you like, if not ally, of China as well as of Pakistan. And the one key interest there is minerals, for instance, and the other key interest there is to keep the Americans at bay. So these are all, where divergent interests converging in Afghanistan, if you like. So that's going to be a minefield of diplomacy, which our diplomats will be really sort of, working overtime to tackle. The other thing I think I would like to highlight in this visit is, I know that the Prime Minister spoke of e-visas and group visas for Russian tourists. I don't see much new in this. Russian tourists have been regulars on the India circuit for decades and decades. In fact, there was a time when there was even a pushback, an infamous Russian tourism mafia in holiday destinations like Goa, for instance, where I currently am. Defense deals, yes, I do see a huge potential there, because if you remember, they went into limbo just when India had begun to urgently need spare replacements and parts for its arsenal, which, as we all know, is dominated by Russian weapons. But Russia was preoccupied in Ukraine and along its other fronts, so those fell back a little. So in the interim, and of course then, there is still a strong keenness. There's a new jet whose name I forget, but there's also the Su-400, the famous Su-400, which apparently served India very well during Operation Sindoor. So there is a demand for Russian weapons. I've spoken to many, many analysts in the Indian Armed Forces, and they all agree that you cannot cannot, India is never going to completely sort of replace its arsenal of Russian weapons. So that is potential. I see that potential in these talks. And the other thing is this labor thing, is highly interesting to me. I don't think Russia can replace the United States, as a destination for, let's say, IT talent or for other Indians going abroad and seeking work. But I see it as definitely an effort. There's repeated emphasis on labor, especially by the visiting president. I see it as definitely an effort or a response to the H-1B restrictions in the US. Even in his television interview on another channel, again, he emphasized labor at great length. So I think it sounds as if Russia is trying to fill that gap of H-1B visas shriveling up for Indians and hopes to attract that talent to Russia. But is that going to happen? I think it's highly unlikely. Quite apart from language issues and perhaps even the quality of education, quality of research and development, which are all of high standards undoubtedly in Russia. But I don't think Russia is there yet to compete, at least from the Indian perspective, with the United States on that front. The last point I'd like to make is that the speaking of oil now, President Putin has repeatedly said he will ensure that uninterrupted shipments, quote unquote, of fuel to India continue. And he says, we're ready to continue with that for this fast-growing Indian economy, and we're ready to supply everything that India requires to develop its energy. But is India going to continue to accept uninterrupted shipments? You remember that it isn't long ago that oil imports from Russia were cut by nearly, under the sanctions, cut by nearly 30%. And I think that is, analysts are saying that is expected to decline quite dramatically and even further from something like 1.8, I think the unit is million barrels per day or something, MBPD, in November to 1 million barrels. And the slide will go further. So I don't think and I don't think India is going to walk the tightrope on the oil. It has to, because the United States is far too important. So as I said, the most interesting thing I also found, the last most interesting thing in this trip, I find, is the underlining by Prime Minister Modi, in this case, India-Russia cooperation in the energy sector, specifically in that they will continue that they will also be expanding that cooperation to look for critical minerals. And that's what brings me back to Afghanistan again. So if, they're going to look for critical minerals elsewhere, then that's also an interesting development and shows a kind of a synergy between the two countries. So all in all, there's a lot of hope.
Yes, it's important that you brought up the issue of oil, because there's a lot of importance to the oil issue as far as India, Russia, and America are concerned. Madhvanji, don't you think this is a mismatch? We'll play the President Putin's bite specifically on that when he says that there are oil supplies that India can take. The oil supply for its energy needs, there is no end to them. But on the other hand, there are sanctions on some companies, which has led India to drop its buying of oil from Russia. And Trump has gone on record to say that India has conveyed that it's going to end all oil buying from Russia. Let's first hear what Putin said before you can respond, Madhvanji.
Rubles have been used to provide loans for large joint projects. We are also seeing successful partnership in energy. Russia is a reliable supplier of oil, gas, coal, and everything that is required for the development of India's energy. We are ready to continue uninterrupted shipments of fuel for the fast-growing Indian economy. Of course, the bilateral interaction in energy does not limit to that. We are also conducting a flagship project to build the largest Indian nuclear power plant, Kudankulam. 2 out of 6 reactor units have been already connected to the energy network, and 4...
Yes, Madhvanji.
Interesting question, because officially, Putin said in his interview to the Indian channel yesterday that, look, it's difficult for a third country it's not proper, and also difficult for a third country to stop bilateral trade between two countries. So while it is true that Russian oil from India may come down at one level, in the overall context of Indo-Russian trade, there are other ways India can help Russia and Russia can help back. Uh, there has been a mention of a submarine deal involving $2 billion. I don't know how much of that is coming through, but more interesting, Modi has his Make in India plan for both fertilizers as well as defense manufacturing. So we might shift some of the Russian defense relationships that go back 70 years from mere imports to more joint manufacturing. That is one possibility. If you're talking about Afghanistan, there is a geopolitical as well as geoeconomic element. Like I said, Padma was right. If you're talking about cutting edge artificial intelligence, Indians would still look to the US, and US is miles ahead, and China is after that, so Russia comes later. But if you look at cyber security, Russian hackers have been quite famous in that sphere. So Indian software power can involve joint ventures there in minerals. If I mentioned Vedanta, for instance. So if you want to dig for minerals in Afghanistan, there's nothing stopping civil engineers from India going there. Please remember, although under Taliban, a parliament building has no meaning, but India is the country that helped build Afghanistan a parliament building. So in civil engineering, in minerals, in cybersecurity, in pharmaceuticals, in defense manufacturing, in fertilizers, there's a lot of scope that can be fulfilled, except that the messaging from this visit is very clear. There is a lot of potential out there. And, for instance, I'm looking at a paperback novel like a scenario where Japanese money, Central Asian minerals, and Indo-Russian cooperation can go and even engage in Africa together. So the West needs to shed its old hangover of leadership. This is a new normal of multilateralism, I see. There's a lot of hard work needed. But I think, but let's not confuse it with cutting edge technology in which US Trump or no Trump, if you're looking at genomics, if you're looking at artificial intelligence, if you're looking at cutting edge medical treatment, robotics, well, it's still the US. All these nitwit right wingers can claim greatness for US mainly because of the stuff that people who are anti-Trump are doing out there in California.
You're right. Padma, you want to quickly come in before we wrap up?
Yeah.
Africa, and that there might be, growing synergy to work within Africa between India and Russia. Very interesting, because as Madhavan knows, and as we all know, the Chinese are sprawled all over Africa with precisely the same intent and purpose. And they've been, they've been there for much longer than most other powers who are contemplating going in now. So again, that I see as a flashpoint, perhaps. It could become a flashpoint, because the Chinese are not known to form trilateral and multilateral fora which include India as an equal party, as an equal partner, even though we are in BRICS and we are in the Shanghai Cooperation and all that. But I think that will be interesting. We will see interesting days if this Africa project comes about, as Madhavan mentioned.
Right. There are lots of things to discuss. Politics also. In all of this, we're told that Shashi Tharoor has been invited for Putin dinner, and Congress says that no invite for Gandhi. So that's an entirely different topic that we'll discuss and throw light on that at some other point. But thanks so much today for joining us, Madhavanji, Padma Rao, and thanks for our viewers for tuning in and for watching the Mojo Story. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, sir. Pleasure. Thanks.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.